For 10 years, Thomas Okonkwo worked London construction sites and sent every spare pound to his cousin Chidi in Enugu to build the family home. Every month, Chidi sent photos. Every month, the same message, it's coming. Thomas believed him. When he finally flew home, the plot on Abakaliki Road hadn't changed. Raw bush, a rusted gate, not one foundation block. His mother wasn't in the dream house. She was in a rented room, cooking over kerosene, while the neighbors had known the truth for years. This is Thomas Okonkwo, a bricklayer from Enugu State who crossed to London at 26 with one bag and a promise to come back better. He is not famous. He is not exceptional in the way the world measures those things. He is one of millions of men who leave home and hold it together from a distance with wire transfers and faith. But what Chidi did to him is a story about something far darker than stolen money. It is about what happens when trust becomes the weapon. Thomas grew up in Enugu State in southeastern Nigeria, the second of 4 children born to a civil servant father who died when Thomas was 19 and left the family a small plot of land on Abakaliki Road and not much else. That land was not wealth. It was intention. It was his father saying, in the only language he had left, that this family belongs somewhere permanent. Thomas carried that intention like a stone in his chest for years. He worked local construction in his early 20s, mixing cement on other men's sites, watching other men's houses rise from the ground, and knowing with the quiet certainty of someone who has counted his options carefully that there was no future big enough for him here. Not yet. In 2012, his cousin Chidi helped him find a contact in London, a man who knew a labor broker who placed Nigerian workers on construction crews in East London. The visa cost Thomas nearly everything he had saved. He borrowed the rest from his mother, a Daisy, who pulled the money from a tin she kept under the kitchen floorboards without telling him she had been saving it for her own medical care. He did not know that for years. He landed at Heathrow on a February morning so cold it felt like an insult. He had never felt weather like that. He told the story later to anyone who would listen, how he stood outside the arrivals terminal in a jacket that was entirely wrong for England and laughed at himself because laughing was cheaper than crying. Within 3 weeks, he was on a crew in Stratford. Within 3 months, he had moved from day labor into skilled groundwork. He was a fast learner and a harder worker, and those two things together are a kind of currency that crosses borders cleanly. He rented a room in a shared house in Plaistow with 5 other men, 2 from Ghana, 1 from Zimbabwe, 2 from Enugu, just like him. They ate together, argued about football, and sent money home. That was the rhythm of that life. Work, eat, sleep, send money home. Thomas sent his to Chidi. This is where the story has to slow down for a moment, because the choice of Chidi matters. Chidi was not a stranger. He was the cousin who had attended Thomas's father's burial, the one who sat beside a Daisy and held her hand while she wept. He was the cousin who had said at that graveside that the family would not fall apart, that he would make sure of it. Thomas had heard those words and believed them the way you believe something spoken over a coffin. When Thomas sketched the house on a paper serviette the night before his flight, it was Chidi he handed it to. 4 bedrooms. A deep veranda facing the road. A borehole for clean water. Tiled floors. A small garden for his mother. He even noted the dimensions, because Thomas had spent enough time on building sites to know that a dream without measurements is just a wish. Chidi folded the serviette and put it in his shirt pocket and said, "Leave it with me." For the first 2 years, the updates were regular and detailed. Chidi called on Sunday evenings. He described negotiations with land surveyors, arguments with block suppliers about prices, delays from rainy season. All of it sounded exactly like what Thomas knew construction to sound like, specific enough to be real. Then the photos began arriving. Foundation trenches filled with concrete, walls rising course by course, lintels poured above window frames, a roof frame going up. Thomas would receive these images on his phone standing in a muddy trench in East London and feel something enormous move in his chest. He was building 2 things at once: someone else's structure in England, and his family's future in Enugu. That feeling kept him going through the winters, through the injuries, through the years he spent eating alone in cold rooms while the rest of London moved around him like water around a stone. He sent £43,000 over 10 years. He kept records. He is that kind of man. What he did not know, and would not know until he stepped through the gate on Abakaliki Road, was that every single one of those photographs had been taken from other people's construction sites. Stolen images, recycled lies, a decade of theater performed by one man for an audience of one. And when Thomas finally arrived home and found raw bush where his mother's house should have been standing, the first thing he felt was not anger. It was confusion. Because the mind will protect you from the worst truth for as long as it possibly can. He stood at that rusted gate for a long time. Then he asked a neighbor where his mother was living now. The neighbor looked at the ground before answering. The neighbor's name was Mr. Eze. He was an older man who had lived on Abakaliki Road for 30 years and knew every family on that street the way people in close neighborhoods know things, not from asking, but from watching. He looked at Thomas for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has been holding a difficult piece of information and is relieved to finally give it to the person it belongs to. Your mother, he said, is on Ogi Road, behind Emeka's mechanic shed. The blue door. Thomas did not speak. He got back into the car he had hired from the airport and drove. Ogi Road was 20 minutes away. He made the drive in silence, which was unusual for him. Thomas Okonkwo is a man who fills silence with words, with jokes, with plans spoken out loud. People who know him describe him as someone who processes everything verbally, who thinks by talking. But on that drive, he had nothing. Language had temporarily abandoned him. He found the blue door. He knocked. There was a long pause before it opened, and when it did, a Daisy stood in the frame looking at her son with an expression that broke in two directions at once. There was joy in it, pure and immediate, and underneath the joy, pressed down as hard as she could press it, was shame. The room behind her was small enough that you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms. A single bed, a wooden chair, a kerosene stove on the floor, a plastic basin, a curtain instead of a second door. On a shelf near the window sat 3 photographs in frames. Thomas's father on their wedding day. Thomas himself in his work gear, hard hat pushed back on his head, grinning, and the 4th photograph was the house. The house from the photos Chidi had sent, printed out and framed. Thomas walked into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed because there was nowhere else to sit, and he looked at that photograph for a long time. His mother sat beside him and took his hand. She did not explain. She did not need to. She had framed a picture of a house that did not exist because it was the only version of the future she had been given. When she finally spoke, she said she was sorry for the state of the room. Thomas told her to stop. Then she said something that reordered everything he thought he knew. She said Chidi had visited her, regularly at first. He would come with small amounts of cash and tell her the building was progressing. He told her Thomas was working very hard, but that the construction was expensive and these things take time. He told her to be patient. He told her not to call Thomas too often, because the calls distracted him, and a distracted man on a construction site could get hurt. That last part was the one that silenced Thomas completely. Chidi had not just stolen the money. He had engineered a Daisy's silence by turning her love for her son into a leash. He had taken a mother's deepest fear, the fear of causing harm to her child, and made it into a wall between them. Every time she thought about calling Thomas to say something was wrong, she heard Chidi's voice in her head. A distracted man on a construction site could get hurt. She had swallowed her own distress for years to protect a son who was sending money for years to protect her. Neither of them knew the other was suffering, and Chidi had built that particular cruelty with precision. Thomas stayed with his mother for 2 hours. He paid 3 months of rent in advance to the mechanic who owned the compound. He bought food from a shop 2 streets over. He did all of this quietly, practically the way he handles things when emotion becomes too large for words. Then he asked his mother one question. Where is Chidi now? Adeze hesitated. Then she said she had heard he was staying at a hotel near the government reservation area. The presidential. She said this with a particular flatness in her voice that told Thomas she had known this for some time and had spent considerable energy trying not to think about what it meant. The presidential hotel in Enugu is not the most expensive hotel in the state, but it is far from cheap. It is the kind of place where politicians hold meetings and businessmen run tabs. It has a bar on the ground floor with imported spirits behind the counter and leather stools, and the particular atmosphere of a place where men with money feel comfortable spending it in front of other men with money. Thomas found Chidi there at 7 in the evening. He was at the bar, exactly as Thomas had somehow already pictured him, in a pale linen shirt with leather shoes that had not been bought locally. He was ordering drinks for two other men at the counter, laughing at something with the loose ease of a person who has absolutely no reason to believe this evening will end differently from any other. Thomas sat down beside him. Chidi turned, and the laugh stopped. Not immediately. That would have been too honest. The laugh faded in stages, the way a power cut moves through a building, room by room, until the whole structure is dark. Chidi's face moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been calculation. And then, underneath all of that, fear, Thomas, he said. Thomas said nothing. He placed his phone on the bar counter. On the screen was his banking history. 10 years of transfers, every one of them labeled. For the house, for the borehole, for the materials, for the foundation, for the roof. Chidi looked at the screen, then back at Thomas, and here is the thing that Thomas had not expected. Chidi did not immediately deny it. He did not say there had been a mistake or that the money had gone somewhere legitimate. Instead, he said something that revealed exactly the kind of man he was. He said, "You were doing well. You could afford it." Thomas stared at him. Chidi continued, and this is important because it shows how completely he had justified the whole thing to himself. He said Thomas had left. He said Thomas had a life in London while the family was still here dealing with everything, with the land, with the old house, with the Daisy's health, with all the things that don't get easier just because one person escapes. He said Thomas sent money but never came back, and the money had to go somewhere useful, and wasn't Chidi the one who had stayed? This is a particular kind of logic that is worth recognizing, because it is not rare. It is the logic of proximity used as moral license. The person who stays believes that staying gives them rights over what the person who leaves sends back. It is the logic of the gatekeeper who eventually begins to believe the gate belongs to him. Thomas understood all of this in the moment. He is not a man who lacks intelligence, but understanding something and being able to respond to it calmly when you are sitting 2 feet away from the person who robbed your mother of 10 years are two very different things. He picked up his phone. He stood up. He looked at Chidi for one long moment. Then he said, "I have every transfer, every date, every amount, and I have the photographs you sent me." Chidi's expression shifted, because Thomas had asked a man on his London crew with some technical knowledge to trace the origins of those building progress photographs. And what that man had found was something Thomas had not fully processed until this moment, standing in a hotel bar in Enugu. The photographs were not random. They were not stolen from strangers' social media or pulled from construction websites. Every single image had been taken from one specific building site, the same compound, photographed across several years as it was genuinely built by its actual owners. Thomas knew whose compound it was. It was Chidi's brother-in-law's house. Chidi had stood at a relative's building site with his phone, documented someone else's progress month by month, and sent those images to a man working in the cold of East London as proof of a house that was rising from the ground. He had not even bothered to find strangers. He had used family. Thomas walked out of the presidential hotel into the night air of Enugu and stood in the car park with £40,000 in saved cash in a bank account, a mother in a rented room, and a plot of empty land that had been waiting 10 years for a foundation that was never coming. He had two choices in front of him now, and neither one of them was simple. The two choices Thomas had were simple on the surface, but impossibly complicated underneath. He could call the police, or he could walk back into that hotel and handle it in a way that courts and constables would never be involved with. He had enough rage in him for either option. He chose neither that night. Instead, he drove back to his mother's room, lay down on the floor beside her bed, and thought. Adeze did not ask him what he was planning. She turned off the kerosene lamp, and in the dark she said, "Don't do anything that puts you in a cell, Thomas. I have lost enough already." He did not sleep. By morning he had made a decision. But before he could act on it, he needed to understand the full shape of what Chidi had built. Because one thing Thomas knew from years on construction sites was that you never start demolishing a structure until you understand exactly how it was assembled. He started with the land itself. He went to the Enugu State Ministry of Lands and requested the registration history for the plot on Abakaliki Road. The clerk brought him the file. Thomas looked at the document. Then he looked again. The land had been registered under a new name 18 months earlier. Not Chidi's name, a stranger's name. Someone Thomas had never heard of. The plot had been sold. This is where the story changes shape entirely. Because Chidi had not simply taken 43,000 pounds and built nothing with it. He had also sold the underlying land. The ground itself. The thing Thomas's father had spent his working life acquiring. The thing Thomas had been wiring money to develop for a decade. Chidi had converted it into cash and put that cash somewhere Thomas could not see. There had never been any intention to build. Not at any point. The house was never a delayed project or a mismanaged fund. It was a stage set, constructed with patience and maintained across 10 years to keep one man's transfers arriving every month without interruption. Thomas sat in the ministry corridor on a plastic chair and put his face in his hands. Not because he was falling apart, he is not a man who falls apart easily, but because the full geometry of the betrayal had just become visible, and he needed one moment to measure it before he stood back up and decided what to do next. When he stood, he called a lawyer. Her name was Chioma Adeyemi. She practiced in Enugu and specialized in land disputes and financial fraud. Thomas had the number from a man on his London crew who had used her 2 years earlier when a property deal in Lagos collapsed. He had stored it in his phone under the note, "Land Problem Lagos, good result." He told her everything in a single call outside the ministry building. She listened without interrupting. Lawyers who don't interrupt you while you describe a crime are either very good or very bored. Chioma Adeyemi was not bored. She told him 3 things. First, the land sale could be challenged if the original family title predated the transfer and his father's estate succession had been properly documented. Second, 10 years of international wire transfers combined with demonstrably false representations made to obtain them constituted provable fraud. Third, and this was the part that reached through the phone and rearranged something in Thomas's chest, she said she had seen this structure before. Not this story exactly, but this pattern. She called it diaspora remittance fraud, flatly, the way you name something you have seen too many times. Someone leaves, someone stays. The person who stays positions themselves as the trusted local agent, exploits the distance and the guilt, and the impossibility of proper oversight from overseas, and builds a machine that runs on the leaving person's love for the ones they left behind. She had handled 4 cases with this exact architecture in the past 3 years alone. Thomas asked how they ended. 2 settlements, she said. 1 still in litigation. 1 criminal conviction. He asked what she thought was possible here. She said it depended on whether Chidi still had access to the money or had already spent it. Thomas already knew the answer. The linen shirt. The imported leather shoes. The rounds of drinks at the presidential hotel, ordered with the ease of a man who has never once checked his balance before spending. He had spent it. Probably most of it. Men who run schemes like this rarely save the proceeds. They perform wealth because the performance is the whole point. But then Thomas discovered something that made even that picture insufficient. It came through his mother's side of the family. A cousin named Ngozi, who lived in Abuja, had heard through the network that Thomas was back and asking questions. She called him on the third day without prompting. She had something to tell him, she said. She had been waiting for someone to ask. She told him that Chidi had approached her husband 2 years earlier with a business proposition. He described himself as managing remittance funds on behalf of several diaspora family members and said he was looking for a local investment partner for a building materials supply venture. Ngozi's husband had declined. But one phrase had stayed with her ever since. Several diaspora family members. Thomas asked her to repeat it. Several diaspora family members. He had not been the only one. This is the moment that reframes every single thing that came before it. Because until this point, the crime was enormous, but it had a shape you could hold in your mind. One cousin. One betrayal. One decade. The scale of it was personal. It had a face and a name and a motive you could trace back to proximity and greed and envy dressed as grievance. Several diaspora family members meant something structurally different. It meant Thomas had not been a victim. He had been a revenue stream. One of several. The Sunday evening phone calls, the progress photographs, the calibrated detail about rainy season delays and supplier negotiations, all of it may have been running simultaneously, in parallel, deployed against multiple targets at once. Thomas spent the following day making calls. He found two others, a man named Ikechukwu in Dublin, who had been sending money for 7 years to build a home for his mother in Nsukka. The mother was still renting. The land had never been touched. Ikechukwu had stopped asking questions 18 months earlier, when Chidi told him there was a boundary dispute with a neighboring family that required legal resolution before construction could resume. He had believed it completely, because boundary disputes are common and real, and Chidi had described the procedural details with a kind of specific frustration that only sounds authentic. And a woman named Adaura in Canada, who had sent money for 5 years toward her father's retirement property in Oji River. Her father had never seen a block laid. When she called Chidi directly, he told her the project was paused because her father had failed to sign a required document at the local government office, and nothing could proceed until that was completed. She had spent 6 months trying to coordinate that visit for a document that did not exist. 3 families. That Thomas knew of. That had been willing to answer a stranger's calls and admit what had happened to them. There was no way of knowing how many others were still waiting for Sunday evening updates that told them to be patient. That construction was almost ready to resume. That family was built on trust. Thomas called Chioma Adeyemi that evening and told her everything he had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is no longer a civil matter." He asked what it was. She said, "This is a criminal investigation, and there is a specific agency that handles it, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission." She gave him the address of the Enugu office. She told him to bring the bank records, the photographs with their traced origins, every screenshot of every conversation he had with Chidi over 10 years, and anything Ikechukwu and Adora were willing to provide. Thomas wrote down the address. And somewhere across the city, in a hotel bar, or a rented apartment, or wherever Chidi was spending his Tuesday evening, he had no idea that 3 countries' worth of evidence was being organized into a folder that would reach a federal agency before the week was out. But there was one more thing Thomas still had to do before any of that could move forward. And it was the hardest thing of all. He had to go back and tell his mother the complete truth about what had been done in her name, and in the name of the father she had buried, and in the name of the grandchildren she had never stopped praying, would one day play on tiled floors in a house with a deep veranda facing the road. He had to say it all out loud. And she had to hear it. Thomas sat with his mother for 3 hours that evening. He did not rehearse what he was going to say. He had learned in 10 years of working with other people's structures that rehearsed things tend to collapse under real conditions. So he just sat across from her at the small wooden table in the room behind the mechanic's shed and told her everything. The land sale, the registration in a stranger's name, the other families, the words several, and everything it meant. Adeze listened without moving. When he finished, the room was so quiet they could hear the mechanic's radio playing through the wall. She did not cry immediately. She did what certain people do when pain exceeds the capacity for visible response. She became very still. Then she looked at the framed photograph on the shelf, the one she had printed from the images Chidi had sent, the house that never was. She stood, took it from the shelf, and placed it face down on the bed. That was all she said about it. But then she did something Thomas had not expected. She told him she had known something was wrong for 4 years. Not the specifics, not the fraud, not the scale, not the other families. But she had known in the way that people who have lived long enough come to know things without being able to prove them. She had stopped asking Chidi questions because asking made him distant, and distance was more frightening than uncertainty. So she had chosen to believe the photographs, not because she was naive, but because the alternative was too heavy to carry alone. Thomas told her she should not have had to carry it alone. She said that was the thing about people who love someone too much. They always try to carry things alone to spare the person they love. He understood she was describing both of them. The FCC case opened officially 12 days after Thomas walked into their Enugu office with a folder that the receiving officer described as unusually well organized. The bank records, the traced photograph origins, the land registration documents, the statements from Ikechukwu in Dublin and Adara in Canada, both submitted electronically through the lawyer, and a printed copy of the messaging history between Thomas and Chidi across 10 years, 147 exchanges, every one of them a calculated performance. Chidi was located and questioned within the first week. He did not flee. This surprised Thomas when Chioma told him. But she explained that men who run long schemes often don't run when confronted, because they have spent so long believing their own version of events that they initially approach arrest as a misunderstanding that can be explained away with the right combination of charm and partial truth. Chidi tried exactly that. He told investigators that the building project had experienced genuine delays and that the funds had been partially consumed by legitimate expenses he had failed to document properly. He described himself as an overwhelmed local manager, not a fraudster. He used the word mismanagement 11 times in the first interview, according to what Chioma relayed to Thomas. She said the investigators were unmoved because mismanagement does not photograph other people's houses and send the images as evidence of your own progress. The buyer of the Abakaliki Road plot was a businessman from Onitsha who had purchased it through an intermediary and held documentation showing a legitimate transaction. The land challenge became complex for exactly this reason. A court order froze any further development while the title chain was audited. The question of whether the sale could be reversed depended on whether the original buyer could be proven to have had knowledge of the fraudulent transfer. That investigation was still in progress when Thomas made his next decision. He used 38,000 pounds of his saved 40,000 to begin building on a different plot. He bought it outright. Clean title, verified at the registry himself, with Chioma present. A corner plot on a quieter road 3 streets from where his mother had been renting. He hired a local contractor recommended by Mr. Eze, the neighbor from Abakaliki Road who had first told him where to find Adeze. He supervised the foundation himself. He flew back to London to complete his remaining work contracts, then returned 4 months later when the walls were at window height. The house was not the one on the serviette. It had 3 bedrooms, not 4, and the veranda faced a different direction. But it had the borehole. It had the tiled floors. And it had something the original plan never included. A second room off the kitchen that Thomas designed specifically for Adeze's kerosene stove, fitted instead with a proper gas line, because he never wanted to see his mother cooking on a stove that smelled like danger again. Adeze moved in on a Thursday in the dry season. She brought almost nothing from the room behind the mechanic's shed. Everything she owned fit in 2 bags, which Thomas said was something he intended to fix within the year. Ikechukwu came down from Dublin for the occasion. He had pressed his own complaint through the FCC process and was still waiting for resolution on his mother's land in Nsukka. But he came to Enugu for a Thursday in someone else's new house, because sometimes you need to be in a room where something went right. Adora sent a message from Canada that Thomas read aloud to his mother in the new kitchen while the gas burner worked quietly, and the smell of egusi soup moved through the house for the first time. Now here is the detail that closes this story in a way Thomas himself described as almost too strange to believe. 2 months after Adaisy moved in, a woman appeared at the gate asking for Thomas. She was the wife of the man who had bought the Abakaliki Road plot. She had seen the case mentioned in a local newspaper report about the FCC investigation. She had done her own research. She came to tell Thomas that her husband had not known the land was fraudulently transferred. They had purchased it in good faith and were now themselves facing legal uncertainty over a property they had paid for legitimately. She did not come to argue. She came to propose something. She said her husband wanted the matter settled without prolonged litigation. He proposed returning the plot to its rightful ownership in exchange for reimbursement of his verified purchase price, which Chidi would be ordered to pay through the court process. It would take time, but the land could come back. Thomas shook her hand at the gate. He did not tell his mother immediately. He waited until he was sure. He waited until the legal framework was in place, and the words were more than a possibility. Then one evening, when they were sitting on the new veranda, the one that faced the wrong direction but caught the evening light anyway, he told her that her husband's plot on Abakaliki Road was coming home. Adaisy looked out at the street for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have liked this house." Thomas said he knew. She said, "He also would have liked that you didn't give up." And that was the sentence Thomas carried with him back to London 6 weeks later. Not the FCC case, which was still moving through its process. Not the £43,000, most of which was gone, and some of which might eventually be recovered through court orders on whatever remained of Chidi's accessible assets. Not even the house, real and standing and filled now with his mother's presence. It was the fact that he had not given up. That when the thing he had built across 10 years from a distance turned out to be nothing, he had stood in the ruins of it and decided to build again. With his own hands this time, with his own eyes on every course of block. There is a particular kind of loss that does not announce itself as loss. It comes dressed as normal life, as ordinary updates, as Sunday phone calls that reassure you that everything is fine and the work is progressing and you should focus on your end because they are handling things on theirs. It is the kind of loss that requires someone else's lie to sustain itself, which means it can only be measured in full once the lie has finally stopped. Thomas Okonkwo lost 10 years to that kind of loss. What he is building now, on a corner plot 3 streets from where his mother used to hide her face from neighbors, is not a replacement. You do not replace 10 years, but you can build something over the ground where they were taken from you. Something with solid walls and a gas burner and a veranda that catches the evening light. And sometimes that is what survival looks like when it finally stops apologizing for itself. There are millions of Thomas Okonkwos in the world right now. They are working night shifts in Manchester and Houston and Kuala Lumpur. They are sending money home on the first of every month. They are trusting someone at the other end, a cousin, a sibling, a childhood friend, because distance makes trust a necessity rather than a choice. You cannot be in 2 places at once, so you give someone the part of you that stays. Most of those people will never be robbed. Most of the people receiving that trust will honor it in the quiet, unremarkable way that loyalty usually works, without anyone making a documentary about it, without a story worth telling. But some will not, and the ones who will not are often the ones who know you best. The ones who know exactly how much you love the people you left behind. The ones who understand that your guilt about leaving makes you generous, and that your distance makes you easy. That is the specific cruelty of this kind of betrayal. It does not target your weakness, It targets your love. It uses the best thing about you as the instrument of your own destruction. The question Thomas Okonkwo has been asked repeatedly since his story became known is whether he regrets leaving. He says no, without hesitation. He says the leaving was never the mistake. The mistake was believing that love at a distance could survive without verification. That trust sent through a wire transfer was the same as trust you could look in the eyes. He says he knows better now. He also says he would do it again. The going, the building, the sending, all of it. Because his mother is on a new veranda in a house with solid walls, and the evening light is coming through exactly the way he sketched it on that serviette the night before he flew to England. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and tell us what part hit hardest. And if you believe the people who sacrifice in silence deserve to have their stories told, subscribe so you never miss what we bring you next.